Welcome to the Allison Gary Show. Wee, wee.
Thank you guys for coming back tonight for another installment of The Brother of Jesus and the Lost Teachings of Christianity by Jeffrey Boots. Last week, we went over the original argument to decide how that Yeshua was felt about by his family and his brother James in particular, who is the subject of our discussions in this book. And we went over several verses that seem to cast the family in a poor light. However, we discussed how you could read it with different translations, and you could realize that Mark has an agenda in his gospel that is not necessarily in any of the other gospels. And we're going to finish up a little bit of that, and then we're going to move on to how James is portrayed in Acts and in a little bit in Galatians. So there is a scholarly trend that finds Mark's gospel has a hidden agenda, as I said. John Dominic Crossan and Burton Mack see Mark's writings as a polemic against the Jerusalem church leadership, and specifically against Yeshua's apostles and his family. Mark puts the disciples in a negative light. It is seen as a literary device to denigrate the disciples and indirectly the conservative Jewish Christian group that held on to Jewish practices and rejected the idea of a Gentile mission. Scholars termed this group, quote-unquote, Judaizers, and seemed to find that they were the second-generation leadership of the Jerusalem church, which claimed the support of James and the apostles for their practices. So everyone needs to realize that there was no homogeneous Christianity at this time. There were competing factions with different interpretations of Yeshua. In fact, Judaism had several major sects at that time. There was a great upheaval in sense of change going on with the Roman occupation and with the various unsuccessful challenges to the Roman rule, with the development of the various types of Judaism. So everything was open and possible at that point. So the question of Yeshua's nature, human or divine, was especially divisive and was not resolved until the Council of Nicaea in 325 Common Era. Those who disagreed with the majority at Nicaea in the vote were declared heretics. The roots of this fight over the nature of Yeshua came from the earliest Jewish Christian and Gentile Christian communities. There was tension between Paul and the Jerusalem church. Many scholars have begun to reread the New Testament with consideration to this conflict. Michael Goulder, in his book, St. Paul versus St. Peter, A Tale of Two Missions, looks at the efforts of the gospel writers with this conflict in mind. He states, quote, Mark looks like a Pauline, hostile to Yeshua's family who ran the Jerusalem mission in his time, ambivalent about the disciples, but down on their followers if they started talking about authority. Matthew steadily exonerates both groups and seems, if anything, sympathetic to the Jerusalem leadership. Luke is an ironic character, friendly to both sides. As for John, he is an ultra-Pauline. He tells us that Yeshua's brothers did not believe in him. That's the fundamental sin in the whole fourth gospel. They tried to hustle Yeshua to go to Jerusalem before his time, end quote. Goulder notes that Luke and Matthew leave out any animosity towards the family that is present in Mark's gospel. He offers the following reason why, quote, Matthew and Luke seem to have a tendency to exonerate Yeshua's family. And we could explain this by the view that they were much more sympathetic to the Jerusalem church than Mark was. In the case of Luke, we really know this was so because we have a second book Luke wrote, the Acts of the Apostles. Peter and the other 11 are the heroes in chapters 1 through 12, and Paul is the hero in chapters 13 through 28. And in chapter 15, when the issue of Gentiles keeping the law is discussed, everyone agrees with Paul, and the Gentiles are not made to observe it. So we know that Luke is a liberal Pauline, but he wants the church united and the two missions reconciled, and he will not tell stories in which Yeshua's family comes out badly, end quote. John Dominic Crossan thinks, quote, even if there was some pre-Markan evidence of tension between Yeshua and his relatives in the tradition, it is Mark himself who, one, equated their attempt to restrain Yeshua as one insane with the accusation of the Jerusalem scribes that he was possessed, and two, mentioned the relatives by name and then added that these also did not honor him in 6:1 through 6, end quote. Crossan thinks that Mark did this because he was battling on two fronts against the Judaizing quote-unquote heretics in the Markan community who claimed the support of Yeshua's family for their views, and also, quote, in whole or in part, against the jurisdictional and doctrinal hegemony of the Jerusalem church, end quote, which was led by James. His evidence is, quote, the villains of Markan theology are not just the disciples in general, but the inner three, Peter, James, Yeshua's brother, and John in particular. To focus the failure of the disciples in general on the three in particular, and most especially on Peter, can hardly be derived merely from a desire to personify the heretics within the Markan community. It seems rather to point towards the Jerusalem mother church, where the importance of Peter on the one hand and of an inner three on the other is witnessed to by a text such as Galatians 2:7 through 10. Secondly, the animosity of Mark to the relatives of Yeshua points likewise against the Jerusalem church, because it is here that James, the brother of the Lord, becomes important. The polemic against the disciples and the polemic against the relatives intersect as a polemic against the jurisdictional hegemony of the Jerusalem Mother Church.
Wow.
End of quote. You have any insight on that, Jackson?
Hegemony.
Love that word. Word of the day.
It comes from a Greek word, hegemon. That's what they call people like Pilate and the head of the temple guards. It's a ruler. Let's see, what does it mean in this context? Hegemony. Either having little to do with each other or having a lot to do with each other. What do you think?
I think it's the I'm sorry about that. I believe it's the consolidation of views amongst individuals to become, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry. To become some sort of rules. Sorry.
Forget it.
I know. My brains just went.
Oh, should I just look it up here? Let me just look it up here. See what
Sorry.
it means.
Well, I meant in this context. I think it's talking about the ruling group, basically.
Yeah. That's what I think. Let me just look. What the hey? Leadership or dominance, especially by one country or social group over others.
That works well. One social group over others. If he's talking about communities here, that works. So
yeah, I'll take all this out. Don't worry.
Okay, Allison. Thank you. That was I really lost it. Sorry.
I did too.
All right, in the late 60s, when Mark wrote, the Gentile churches outside of Israel were beginning to resent the authority utilized by Jerusalem, where James and the apostles were leaders. This was the motive for Mark's anti-family and anti-apostle stance. So from this, we realize that there are several trains of thought in the way that the Gospels are written, and also we can see that the faith of James and the family of Yeshua can be summarized at this point to be one, that there is a lack of certainty on the intention of Mark in the use of the Greek words hoi par autuo in verse 320, in 3 verse 21, and there is nothing in the Gospels that incontrovertibly shows opposition to Yeshua by his family during his ministry. And two leading scholars, Painter and Bauchman, have agreed after in-depth study that Yeshua's mother and brothers were his followers in his ministry for some time prior to the crucifixion. They both came to this conclusion, even though Painter is a liberal theologian and Baucham is a conservative scholar. And that relates to mostly to part one. If you didn't hear that, you'll have to go back to hear all of those arguments. The author's next topic is the portrayal of James of Jerusalem through the writings of the book of Acts and Paul's letter to the Galatians. The historicity of Acts has been disputed, so the author relies on Galatians as a primary witness. Paul was there, he had an eyewitness account, and Acts is a later historian's attempt to describe the same events. There is, however, much value to be found in Acts. Scholars think that Galatians was written around 55 CE and Acts around 85 to 90 CE. Paul's account includes his personal biases, which are both subtle and not so subtle, especially in his arguments in Galatians. Paul argues there against the teaching of some influential Jewish Christian leaders who have tried to convince the Gentile Christians in Galatia that they were required to be circumcised and to follow the law of Moses in order to gain salvation. Paul's personal agenda needs to be taken into account when analyzing his text for its historical accuracy. Luke, as well, has his own agenda in his portrayal of the development of the early church. Scholar John Meyer summed up the debate on the historicity of this representation in Acts. Quote, the author of Acts has a noted tendency to smooth over fierce battles in the early church. To what extent his peaceful vision molded his narrative, and indeed, to what extent he enjoyed reliable sources for early Christianity, is still disputed among Lucan scholars. It can be said with a certain amount of truth that the majority of the German scholars have proven more reserved towards the historical reliability of Acts than the British and American scholars. Faced with this disagreement, we would do well to pursue a middle course in which Acts is neither dismissed lightly as a purely theologizing text nor accepted naively as a purely historical text. Each text must be judged on its own merits and on available information from other sources, end quote. Luke himself is clear in the opening of his gospel that he did not personally know Yeshua and therefore relied on earlier written sources. These sources relied on an even earlier oral tradition. He states, quote, many writers have undertaken to draw up an account of the events that have happened, following the traditions handed down to us by the original eyewitnesses. And so I, in my turn, as one who has gone over the whole course of these events in detail, have decided to write a connective narrative. Luke 1 through 3. This is, of course, how all the Gospels were written. The earliest Gospel, Mark, which was a source of Luke, was written some 35 to 40 years after the death of Yeshua. Acts and Luke's gospel were written over 50 years after the crucifixion. The reason for this delay is that the early Christian community did not see a need to commit this history to writing, as Yeshua was expected to return at any time. As decades passed and it became obvious that the return would not happen as soon as expected, an attempt to commit things to writing became needed. Due to this long interval between the actual events and Luke's writing in 85 to 90 CE, Paul's first-hand account in Galatians chapter 2 of one of the key sections in Acts that includes James gives aid to the record of the Jerusalem conference. There is some question if this is indeed the same event that is written of in other instances. The other important passage in Acts that includes James is Paul's final visit to Jerusalem. There is no parallel account from Paul of this. It is one of the we sections of Acts, however, written in the first person and purported to be eyewitness accounts. These complicated factors make sorting through the accounts of Luke and Paul difficult if one is trying to excavate reliable historical evidence of James.
Once you know who wrote Luke's books, then it all falls in place.
You want to add a little there? Or do you want to keep that?
I'll keep it.
Okay.
Maybe I'll do something on that one of these times.
Okay. But it does make a difference if you know who wrote what. If you want any more information, go check the audios on, with anything that has the name game in it. Or how else do you have you titled that?
I think we're experts in the apostolic witness. I believe we know more about the disciples of Messiah than anyone in the world.
It's possible.
I think so.
So
yeah, we'll do maybe one of these times. I'll fill in and we'll do that.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
So, turning back to James and his earliest days in Jerusalem, immediately after Yeshua's ascension, according to Acts, the apostles remained together in Jerusalem, quote, constantly devoting themselves to prayer, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Yeshua, as well as his brothers. 1:14. While not mentioned by name, James is assumed to have been included here as the eldest brother of Yeshua. Paul can attest that James was present at the time of his first visit to Jerusalem in Galatians 1:19, quote, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Peter and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, end of quote. This visit is usually dated to anywhere from 34 to 38 Common Era, just a few years after the crucifixion, which is universally accepted as occurring sometime between 30 and 33 Common Era. This does not mean that James was present in Jerusalem mere weeks after the crucifixion. The Gospels imply the presence of Yeshua's family, as John 19, verse 25, states that his mother was present at his death. Luke does not specifically place her there in his Gospel, but he leaves room for her presence. Luke's Gospel does not detail the family being in Yeshua's company during his ministry, but in Acts, they are suddenly in the company of the apostles immediately after his death. If it was the habit of the family to be in Jerusalem for Passover, or if they had traveled there shortly after Yeshua's crucifixion, it is not clear. Scholar John Dominic Crossan thinks that James may have been in Jerusalem prior to Yeshua's arrival. In his book, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, He speculates, quote, how long had James been in Jerusalem? We know for sure that he was there by about 38 when Paul first met him. Did he come there only after the execution of Jesus, or had he been there long before that? I realize how tentative this is, but much more explanation for James's presence and standing in Jerusalem needs to be given than is usually offered, end quote. He admits that his suggestion is hypothetical, but bases it on the high standing that James achieved in the city in a very short time. It is hard to believe that the apostles who had been with Yeshua from the beginning would have turned the leadership over to James so quickly if James had been opposed to Yeshua or to his mission. He also bases his theory on the, quote, tumultuous reaction, end quote, to the illegal execution of James, which angered the leading Pharisees in Jerusalem, according to Josephus. The Pharisees would not have had such respect for James had he not been in a prominent position in Jerusalem for some time. First, another note on Luke from the Dictionary of Paul and his letters. Quote, Luke had an apologetic purpose in mind in his presentation. He sought to demonstrate that Jerusalem had a central place in the divine plan. He begins his gospel in Jerusalem, Luke 1, 5 through 23, and concludes at the same place, Luke 24, 33 through 53. He begins Acts in Jerusalem as well, Acts 1, 3 through 8, and patterns the spread of the gospel along the lines of the paradigm Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth, Acts 1, verse 8. The centrality of Jerusalem for Luke is also seen in its being the place of the church's origin, Luke 24 and Acts 1. It is the place where key theological debates are settled, as in Acts 15, and from where decrees are promulgated, Acts 15, 19 through 35. Yet, all this is certainly not a purely literary fiction, but based on reality. From the available evidence, the fact is that Jerusalem was indeed the center and the mother church of the Christian movement, end quote. Luke's concern with Jerusalem could override his concern for historical accuracy, however. Luke, for example, places Yeshua's resurrection appearance in Jerusalem rather than in Galilee. Peter reorganized the 12 in Galilee, and then they returned to Jerusalem. Their belief in the imminent return of Yeshua, coupled with the prophecy that the Messiah would appear in Jerusalem for the apocalyptic, quote, day of the Lord, end quote, compelled them to return to Jerusalem after they had fled to Galilee for safety after Yeshua's execution. If James was with the apostles at this time is open to question. If the apostles were in fear of their lives, then James, as Yeshua's next of kin, would have had perhaps a greater fear. If Yeshua was executed for the crime of treason against the Romans would have been suspicious of James. They would have expected him to succeed Yeshua and would have kept him under surveillance as someone liable to break the Pax Romana. The earliest written evidence of James's presence in Jerusalem comes from Paul in Galatians. In this writing, Paul summed up his own activities after his experience on the Damascus Road in somewhere between 32 to 35 CE. Paul records his first visit to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion from persecutor of Christians to apostle to the Gentiles. Quote, then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, Peter, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, end quote. James was, therefore, residing in Jerusalem in the mid-30s. Paul's statement reveals that at least by this time, James was a major figure in the city. Note also that Paul refers to him as an apostle. Paul, unlike Luke, does not confine the designation apostles to the 12. Paul uses the term for any eyewitness of the resurrected Christ, which is how he justifies calling himself an apostle. Quote, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Yeshua our Lord?" End quote. 1 Corinthians 9:1. Paul considers James an apostle on this basis, as he lists James as a witness to the resurrected Yeshua later in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7. In Paul's eyes, there was a quote-unquote apostolic band that included the 12 and all who had seen the risen Yeshua. So at this point, we have Paul's testimony that James was a leading apostle in Jerusalem in the earliest days of the movement, and we have Luke's corroboration that Peter wanted the news of his escape from prison to reach, quote, James and the brethren as soon as possible. The term brethren refers to the general community of believers, not to the family. There is an implication in this request of Peter's, quote, "Tell this to James and the brethren," end quote, according to F.F. Bruce. Another quote, "This implies that James and the brethren associated with him met in a different place from Peter's company, that they belonged, to use Pauline language, to a different house church. It may be inferred that even at this early date, James was the leader of one group in the Jerusalem church and Peter was the leader of another," end quote. This hypothesis is against the traditional understanding that Peter was the sole head of the early church. Scholars thought that James succeeded Peter only after Peter's escape from prison, since at that point he was a fugitive and forced to flee the city and become a traveling missionary to the Jews living in the diaspora. John Painter has a different explanation. Quote, "It has been suggested that the narrative of Acts portrays the leadership of the Jerusalem church at first by the apostles, headed by Peter. Acts 12:1-24 can be read as a kind of flashback to explain how James came to leadership. Herod Agrippa had James, the brother of John, executed, and Peter was thrown in prison. The transition of authority from Peter to James is often taken to be implied by Acts 12:17. But if James were already the leader, nothing would be more natural than for Peter to report back to him. This reading is at least as plausible as the one that takes Peter's message to be a passing on of the authority of leadership. If this is what Luke meant to convey, why does Peter not resume leadership on his return to Jerusalem? In Acts 15, James is portrayed as the leader of the Jerusalem church, even though Peter was then present again. It seems that the prominence of Peter in Acts has been interpreted in terms of his leadership, but that prominence is described more in terms of his activity in relation to those outside the believing community than in terms of leadership of the community. Peter, like Paul, is portrayed as a missionary rather than the leader of a settled community. Acts explicitly names no single leader of the Jerusalem church. The conclusion that Peter was the leader at first is the consequence of the influence of a Catholic interpretive tradition that has no support in relation to Jerusalem. Nothing in Acts supports this view. Indeed, the tradition that Peter was the leader runs contrary to the tradition that concerns the Jerusalem church. This tradition names James as the first leader or bishop. The nomenclature is anachronistic, but the leadership of James is supported by the way in which James is cited in both Acts 15 and 21, as well as in Paul's letters to the Galatians. Oh, I had missed a quote here. In addition, in Acts and Galatians, the sole leadership of James is not explicit. More than likely, James was one of a group of leaders among whom he stood out from the beginning as the leading figure and dominant influence. Upon this basis, the tradition of James as the first bishop of Jerusalem was developed. Another factor that could be considered in assessing James's early leadership of the Jerusalem church is that Peter may have always been a traveling evangelist. James is always portrayed as being in Jerusalem. This is supported in 1 Corinthians, where Paul defends his claims of support that are due to an apostle against those who deny that he is indeed an apostle. Quote, "Do we," meaning Paul and Barnabas, "not have the right to have food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife as the other apostles and the brother of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for our living?" 1 Corinthians 9, 4 through 6. Some say that Paul is contrasting between Yeshua's brothers and the apostles, so that therefore his brothers were not apostles, but that leads to the conclusion that Peter was also not an apostle, since he is mentioned separately as well. This is obviously not the intent. There is here firm support that Peter and Yeshua's brothers were traveling evangelists. It still does not reveal the status of James's position. One view is that, quote, "the Lord's brothers," end quote, alludes to James as well, as there is evidence that James was known at Corinth to his sponsored missionary activity. There is a difference between being a sponsor and taking part in traveling evangelism. This can imply that James was the settled overseer of the Jerusalem church and sponsored all the missionary activities. He could not have carried out this administrative role while engaging in much travel. This all brings us to the conclusion that at least by the time that Peter assumed the role of traveling missionary, James held the leadership of the whole Christian community in Jerusalem and beyond. It can also be argued that James's leadership role wasn't explicitly mentioned because it was common knowledge at the time. Luke and Paul tacitly imply the leadership role James held for the same reason that they give him no introduction. It would have been stating the obvious to their readers. Logically, it makes sense and ties up many biblical loose ends for James, as Yeshua's eldest brother, to assume the leadership after the crucifixion, particularly as Yeshua's role as Messiah was tied to his descent from King David. Ethelbert Stauffer was the first to champion the idea of Yeshua's brothers and family forming a Christian quote-unquote caliphate after his death. There is reliable evidence of this in the later history and tradition of the Jerusalem church. Galatians 1:19 could throw cold water on the theory of James owning the leadership role, though. Paul states that he went to Jerusalem to see Cephas or Peter. If James were the leader, wouldn't Paul have gone to see him instead of Peter? Painter explains, quote, "Paul might have chosen to see Peter because Peter was perceived to be more sympathetic to Paul's case. James, as the leader, was too important to be missed, and Peter may have effected an introduction for Paul," end of quote. This is speculation, but it adds to the case for James having been the leader from the beginning. It also reminds us how difficult it is to find absolute historical certainty. Another bit of evidence in favor of James as the leader is Paul's list of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Scholars agree that Paul preserved a traditional list that had been passed down to him, as it says in his own words that he had, in turn, received the knowledge. This is a very early list and provides evidence that James was considered an apostle, even perhaps at the time of the crucifixion. F. Bruce states, quote, "all the apostles," end quote, should certainly be interpreted as a wider body than, quote unquote, the 12, And equally certainly, James is to be regarded as one of those apostles, as Peter is one of the 12. The appearance of the risen Yeshua to James was no doubt something of which Paul heard from James himself during his first post conversion visit to Jerusalem, just as he would have heard of the appearance to Peter from Peter himself. End quote. The Gospel of the Hebrews includes a claim that the first resurrection appearance was to James, in fact. Quote, and when the Lord had given the linen cloth, which is his burial shroud, to the servant of the priest, he went to James and appeared to him. End of quote. Painter has another idea that this was accurate despite the sequence in 1 Corinthians. According to Adolf von Harnack, the tradition assumes that Yeshua first appeared to Peter in Galilee and that the appearance to James was subsequent to the appearance to the 500 at Pentecost. Jarnack argues that 15 verse 5 and 15 verse 7 reflect a shift from the leadership of Peter to James. Wilhelm Pratcher argues that 15:7 is based on 15:5, reflecting the rivalry between the followers of James and the followers of Peter. Ludemann develops a similar position. If the original leadership of Peter is accepted in this rival factions theory, it reflects a change of leadership in the Jerusalem church. Alternatively, though, we have argued that there was continuing tension between James and Peter, as in Galatians 2, verse 11 through 14. It is possible to see the imposition of Petrine leadership as the later move, end of quote. Painter thinks that James had always been the leader of the Jerusalem church because Yeshua appeared to him first. Later, a community loyal to Peter created a rival tradition claiming that Peter had been the first recipient of a resurrection appearance. Painter basically turns the traditional understanding upside down. Do you have any thoughts on any of that, Jackson?
Yeah, it's a little different perspective than what I have, but I've read that book a couple of times. And the most telling thing, besides that Corinthians passage about the Lord's brothers and the sister wife and everything there, is, of course, Galatians 2 and 3. And the dialogue between James and Paul, as I've mentioned many times in Galatians 2 and James 2. You can even look at Galatians 2:20 and James 2:20. You can see there that they're having a dialogue on this very thing, and they do not agree. And James did not have friends in high places. Paul, as we, in our studies on this and on the real Paul, he had friends in high places. He was not just the poor old tent maker stumbling around and getting beat every other day. He has connections with the Neronic persecutions, and we find that especially in the letters that he wrote between himself and Seneca. There are some letters that are not in the scripture from Paul. And if you know who Seneca is, then you're going to be thinking, well, if Seneca was as good a friend as these letters say, there's something really strange here. In fact, we get to a point where we see Paul, the possibility of Paul turning over to Nero and his gang lists of believers in Rome and Corinth. Nero had a lot to do with Corinth too. Handed over to go looking for somebody to blame for the burning of Rome. So
he put those in Paul's letters, he put the names of all the people right there for people, for the enemies to see it.
And
And
those people in there, we
were,
can identify them today.
yeah, and if that list or those writings were read to Nero, that's like giving him the names and addresses of everyone that he needed to blame this on. You know, it
I
just
think
falls.
Paul got away, though. You look at the last chapter of Acts, I believe that Acts 16 and on were written specifically by another Bible character that we can ferret out in the scripture. But at the last chapter is shocking. I'll leave you to read it closely. It's shocking. And we have one witness, it's about 300 years after the fact, that says that Paul was beheaded on the road to Ostia. We have one witness to that. We have another witness that says that Paul went to Britain. Now, he has to be alive to go to Britain and go all through continental Europe.
Right.
If that, the 29th chapter of Acts, if it's authentic, and it may well be, because Paul's always talking about going to Spain, and there are other documents that put Paul in Britain.
Yes.
Not to mention that his connection with the British royalty, the Druidic royalty, who had long before converted over to the Nazarene idea of Christianity. That's all in the scripture. You just have to make connections. You've got to know the history, ferret out who those people are that he's talking about. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, for instance, we have a senator and 2 druids marked in there.
Yeah.
In Philippians, we have the name of the author of Luke Acts.
Yes.
I know it's, we're really trying to connect dots here, but I think that there are enough dots to connect that we can fairly put forth this kind of theory about Paul. But, it's one thing here to just talk a little around it. It's another thing to get into it.
Yes.
But yeah, if you throw Nazarene Acts in the mix,
then you've got a pretty good pile of things to ferret through and find a completely different answer than the accepted ones.
I get a lot of letters from people all over the world. And this is a topic that comes up very often about the bridge, if there's a bridge between Paul and James or Paul and Peter. And to be right honest with you, Paul is willing to give up circumcision, food ordinances, and everything, because by and large, those things are illegal in continental Europe.
True.
He wants to go to Europe so bad that he's going to give the Torah up and call that Sodom and Egypt. Now, what's going on here? That's enough evidence to find a few more dots and come up with a theory. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for that. That is far more interesting than what I'm presenting here from this book. That's a good little bit. So
I get on that subject and it's hard for me to stop.
That's okay. It's good.
Stuttering and stammering around.
No, you did. That was really good. That is.
I'm looking for compliments tonight.
No. Well, I'm going to go back. I'm going to skip a little bit of what I have here because it's basically repetitive somewhat. And we pretty much have the picture at this point of James being the leader. There is one thing that is a thought, though, of James being the leader. There's a point that it would have been widely assumed that the original apostles knew Yeshua's teachings better than anyone, correct? They were the authorities after Yeshua's execution. Even Paul needed to evaluate his position and mission in light of their judgment of its agreement with Yeshua's teachings. This is why he came to Jerusalem the second time.
It says in Galatians, I think it's chapter 3, that Paul is Christ now.
Yes.
I don't live.
He's the empty man.
The Spirit of Christ lives in me.
Right.
He tells James that. The
And
Spirit of your
James
brother's
calls
living
him,
in
you
me.
empty man.
Yeah.
So,
far out.
Yep. So this idea, though, that Paul needed to have his position evaluated in the light of the judgment of the Jerusalem group has a large implication for our understanding of James's role. It was probably thought that since James was the eldest brother of Yeshua, he would know the quote-unquote mind of the master better than anyone. If he did, Christians today are going to need to reevaluate some of their most deeply held assumptions and beliefs about Yeshua and his teachings. Paul needed to question on whether or not his Gentile converts needed to be circumcised. He needed this answered. Did it need to be done so that they could become Christians or Jewish Christians? If Paul needed to ask the leadership this, it shows that Paul was questioning a widely held assumption that Gentile converts were indeed required to undergo circumcision in order to follow Yeshua. This requirement makes sense when one is reminded that at this point in time, Christianity was a Jewish creation. It was not a separate and distinct religion. It was a sect of Judaism. The only difference between Yeshua's followers and any other Jews was their belief that the long-awaited Messiah of Israel had come in the person of Yeshua. They were not called Christians originally, but called Nazarenes. Acts 24, verse 5 attests clearly to their continued, as in Acts 24, verse 5. Acts also attests clearly to their continued regular attendance at the services of the temple and the goodwill that they had from their fellow Jews. This demonstrates that the disciples' faith and practice remained thoroughly Jewish. Quote, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Day by day, they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising Elohim and having the goodwill of all the people. Acts 2:44 through 47. A point on the disciples continuing to worship in the temple is made by the Jewish scholar Chaim Maccabee. Quote, the book of Acts does not disguise the fact that the Nazarenes of Jerusalem in the days immediately following the death of Yeshua consisted of observant Jews for whom the Torah was still in force. For example, we are told that, quote, they kept up their daily attendance at the temple, end quote, in Acts 2:46. Evidently then, Yeshua's followers regarded the service of the temple as still valid, with its meat and vegetable offerings, its holy of holies, its golden table for the showbread, and its menorah with its 7 branches, symbolizing the 7 planets. All these were venerated by the followers of Yeshua, who made no effort to set up a central place of worship on their own or of their own. Also, their acceptance of temple worship implied an acceptance of the Aaronic priesthood who administered the temple. Though Yeshua's movement had a system of leadership of its own, this was not a rival priesthood, end of quote. Maccabee's conclusion is not mostly considered by Christian scholars, obviously. Scholarship until recently considered Christianity as a complete and total break with Judaism from the time of Yeshua's death, whereas in fact, Christianity became distinct from Judaism through a slow and gradual process, as summed up by James Dunn in his work, The Parting of the Ways, which incidentally I have just recently purchased and intend to read. In the eyes of Yeshua's original Jewish followers, any Gentile who wanted to become a follower of Yeshua was, in fact, becoming a follower of Judaism. Paul's evangelism brought in more and more Gentile converts, and the issue of how far these converts had to become as Jews became very difficult. Male Gentiles would want to avoid circumcision if possible, naturally. Jewish Christians, however, felt that a relaxing of that requirement would threaten possibly all of the requirements of Torah. As Paul's ministry grew, the issue got more important. Was the relaxing of the law of Moses possible under these new circumstances? These are the questions that the Jerusalem Conference had been called upon to decide. And that is where we are going to take the end for this week, because the next section is pretty long and it's slightly different, if that's all right. And I thank you for your assistance a few minutes ago with giving me a little extra material too.
Great. Thank you for doing this again tonight. It's excellent. We got to put the foundation ground in on these. And while we were talking tonight, I got another email for somebody that wants to get into the James Philip connection.
Cool.
That's going to be one we haven't done much with, but I told him back, I said, if this is to be done, you got to be a part of it.
Yeah, good.
All right. Thank you, folks, for coming. Do your Enneagram.
Type 1 Enneagram. All right.
Uh-oh.
I knew it. That's a good one. That is a good one. You're a perfectionist. Very good people.
No, she's perfect.
She is perfect. Perfect people.